It was a quiet morning in Washington, D.C., but what happened next would shake the nation to its core. News anchors across the country were forced to report a story that seemed too outrageous to be true. $100 billion had vanished from USAID, one of the most powerful and trusted government agencies in the world. The money, earmarked for global development and humanitarian aid, was gone without a trace, and nobody knew how it had happened. The first call came in the early hours of the morning, sent out as an urgent alert to the nation's top officials. A major audit had uncovered an unprecedented anomaly in the financial records of USAID. Someone or something had siphoned off billions of dollars meant to help millions. The US government, already struggling with its fair share of problems, now had to face the impossible. A video clip from the press briefing quickly went viral. Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that USAID funds, totaling $100 billion, have been fraudulently diverted. Our investigation is ongoing, but we need your help. The words felt like a slap in the face. The money that was supposed to save lives, that was supposed to build a better future, was gone, stolen right under their noses. At the center of the storm was someone the public never expected, Elon Musk, a man known for revolutionizing technology, space exploration, and electric vehicles. His name was suddenly popping up in news reports across every major media outlet. How could one of the world's wealthiest and most influential entrepreneurs be involved in a scandal like this? Was he a victim, or was he somehow complicit? The FBI was called in immediately, but the first twist in the story came when the agency announced that Musk himself would be questioned. At first it seemed absurd. What could he possibly have to do with such a massive financial theft? But as the investigation unfolded, the question grew bigger. Was Musk involved in something larger than anyone could have imagined? This wasn't just a story about money. It was about trust. Trust in the government, trust in the people who were supposed to protect the interests of the public. And above all, trust in the institutions that were meant to bring about positive change to the world. A new reality was beginning to take shape, a reality where no one, not even a billionaire like Musk, was immune from scrutiny. As the headlines broke, so did the illusion of safety and security. The scandal was just beginning, but the question remained. Who was behind this heist and why? The world was on edge, waiting for the next bombshell. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? As the sun set over Washington, D.C., the investigation into the $100 billion scandal was just getting started. The FBI had mobilized its best agents, and the political world was in turmoil. How could such a massive theft go unnoticed for so long? And more importantly, who was behind it? Agent Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of a large briefing room, her face tense as she addressed a room full of government officials and law enforcement officers. "We're not just dealing with stolen funds here," she said, her voice calm but stern. "This is a coordinated effort to undermine trust in some of the most important institutions in our country. USAID was meant to provide aid to the world's most vulnerable. Now it's become a symbol of betrayal." The room fell silent. Everyone knew how big this was, but no one knew where to begin. The missing money had been moved through a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and dark money channels, making it almost impossible to trace. But the one thing that stood out in all the data was Elon Musk's name, repeatedly showing up in financial transactions linked to key players within USAID. The connections were sparse but undeniable. Musk's companies, particularly SpaceX and Tesla, had been involved in multiple joint ventures with USAID. The links were innocuous at first glance, but with each piece of the puzzle, the picture grew darker. Agent Mitchell wasn't convinced that Musk was the mastermind behind the theft. There was no direct evidence pointing to him being the person who orchestrated the heist, but the timing of his connections to certain USAID projects was too coincidental to ignore. Had he been a pawn, or was he deeper into the conspiracy than anyone realized? The FBI decided to dig deeper into Musk's business dealings with USAID. They started looking at contracts, meetings, and partnerships that seemed ordinary, but under scrutiny, appeared less so. Reports surfaced that some of the contracts had been awarded under suspicious circumstances, anomalies in the bidding process, rushed approvals and connections to high-ranking officials within USAID. The confusion at the same time, the public was being flooded with conflicting reports. Some news outlets painted Musk as the villain, while others speculated that he was merely a scapegoat. Social media was in an uproar, with hashtags like Musk Scandal and USAID Heist trending globally. Musk, known for his unfiltered social media presence, fired off a tweet that only made things worse. "If anyone thinks I'm behind this, they clearly don't understand how I run my businesses. This is bigger than me." His tweet only sparked more controversy. Was Musk trying to cover his tracks, or was he telling the truth? That question was now the focal point of both the FBI's investigation and the public's obsession. While Musk's response seemed dismissive to some, others were starting to consider the possibility that he might not be directly involved. Is Musk just another billionaire caught in the middle of a scheme designed to take down USAID? One commentator asked on live TV. The government's response, inside the halls of power, the pressure to resolve the situation quickly, was mounting. President Elizabeth Carter, whose administration had worked tirelessly to expand foreign aid programs, was facing a political crisis. The scandal threatened to undo years of progress. Aid to vulnerable countries was now on hold, and the international community was beginning to lose faith in the US government's ability to manage its own funds. She convened an emergency session in the White House, bringing together key advisors, the Department of Justice, and members of Congress. "We can't let this destroy us," President Carter said, her voice firm. "We have to find the truth, no matter how ugly it is. We owe it to the American people, and we owe it to the people we were supposed to help." The pressure on the FBI and the investigation was palpable. They knew the world was watching, and every move they made would be scrutinized. But time was running out, and the deeper they dug, the murkier things got. The complexity of the case seemed almost designed to keep them from the truth. As the investigation ramped up, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary financial theft. This was a much larger conspiracy that involved not just stolen funds, but corruption at the highest levels. The web of deceit was only beginning to unravel, and the FBI was still just scratching the surface. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What's one thing you've learned that helped you stay focused during difficult times? The news was everywhere. Late-night talk shows, Twitter feeds, and front-page stories. Elon Musk had become the center of a global storm, with many now questioning just how deeply he was involved in the $100 billion USAID scandal. Was he an unwitting player in a larger conspiracy, or was there something far more sinister behind his connection to the missing funds? Agent Sarah Mitchell sat in her office, looking over pages of documents that were piling up. The investigation into Musk's role had taken an unexpected turn. At first, it seemed like a simple link between Musk's companies, SpaceX and Tesla, and USAID, but the deeper they went, the more they found. The amounts of money that flowed from USAID into companies connected to Musk were staggering, and the timing was impossible to ignore. The connections between Musk and USAID were much more intricate than anyone had initially realized. There were millions of dollars in contracts awarded to Musk's companies, some for projects that had little to no oversight. But what stood out most was a series of obscure transactions between SpaceX and offshore accounts that were tied to shell companies linked to high-ranking USAID officials. Mitchell wasn't ready to say Musk was directly involved, but the evidence was starting to paint a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Musk had publicly denounced any connection to the scandal, but his denials only seemed to raise more questions. In his most recent statement, Musk claimed, "I've worked with USAID on projects, but I had no idea how the funds were managed." This is bigger than anyone realizes. Was he telling the truth, or was he trying to distance himself from something much darker? The turning point. The first breakthrough came when a whistleblower came forward, a mid-level USAID employee, terrified for their safety, reached out to the FBI with shocking new information. According to the whistleblower, high-level officials within USAID had been manipulating contracts for years, using organizations linked to Musk's ventures as a cover for their illegal activities. The whistleblower claimed that several projects funded by USAID were, in fact, little more than fronts for money laundering. They weren't helping anyone, the whistleblower said. They were just passing the money through different companies, hiding it in plain sight. And Musk's companies were involved, but it was the officials who orchestrated everything. He didn't know what was really going on. Agent Mitchell leaned back in her chair, thinking carefully. The whistleblower's testimony added a new layer of complexity to the case. If Musk wasn't the mastermind, then who was? The investigation was now moving from a simple case of theft to something far more intricate, an international conspiracy that might have far-reaching consequences. Musk's public response. Meanwhile, Musk remained steadfast in his public defense. In a live-streamed interview, he claimed, "I am committed to transparency, and if there's evidence against me, then I'll cooperate fully. But I am not involved in this scandal. I've built companies to change the world, not to destroy it." His words rang with sincerity, but the timing couldn't have been worse. He was already under the FBI's microscope, and public pressure was mounting. The media was relentless, with headlines questioning everything about his business dealings and connections. People began to wonder, could someone so powerful, so influential, really be this naive about the way his companies operated? As the story unfolded, Musk's name was getting dragged through the mud, but there were still those who defended him. Many pointed out that Musk had no direct control over the day-to-day operations of USAID-funded projects, and that it seemed unlikely he would be involved in something so nefarious. Yet, there were also whispers in the corners of the business world that suggested Musk's image as a visionary entrepreneur might have been a carefully crafted mask, hiding a more complex truth beneath. The plot thickens. The FBI knew they couldn't rely on Musk's public statements alone. They needed to dig deeper, and they needed help. In a last-ditch effort to get answers, the FBI reached out to a high-powered law firm to help trace the complex financial trail. The firm had deep ties to the international banking world and had experience in dealing with money laundering and corruption cases. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was them. As the law firm's experts dug into the offshore accounts, they uncovered a hidden trail that led to several government officials. It became clear that this was no random act of theft. The money had been systematically diverted over years, funneled through various entities, and Musk's companies had unknowingly acted as intermediaries. The question remained, though, if Musk wasn't the mastermind, who was, and who else was involved in this massive corruption scheme? The first arrest in a stunning turn of events. The FBI arrested George Whitman, a high-ranking USAID official who had been under suspicion from the very beginning. Whitman, who had served as a top advisor for several foreign aid initiatives, was accused of orchestrating a vast network of fraudulent contracts that funneled money into offshore accounts. The arrest shocked everyone, as Whitman had been a trusted figure in U.S. foreign aid for over 2 decades. Whitman's arrest sent shockwaves through Washington. But even with his capture, the investigation was far from over. There were still more questions than answers. Musk's name had been cleared in the immediate fallout of Whitman's arrest, but the investigation was far from complete. It was becoming clear that the scandal was bigger than anyone had imagined, and as the world watched, the FBI was determined to unravel the truth no matter where it led. The arrest of George Whitman had sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C., but it was far from the resolution everyone had hoped for. In fact, it felt more like the beginning of an even deeper mystery, one that had begun to reveal itself in chilling detail. The FBI was no longer just investigating a case of stolen funds. They were now dealing with an intricate web of corruption that stretched far beyond USAID and even Elon Musk's companies. As Agent Sarah Mitchell sat in her office, sorting through a growing stack of documents and testimonies, she felt the weight of the case pressing down on her. Despite Whitman's arrest, the real mastermind behind the scandal was still unknown. Musk had been cleared of any wrongdoing, at least for now. But the more the FBI dug, the more apparent it became that this was no random act of theft. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme, a conspiracy of global proportions, a tangled web of lies. As the investigation expanded, the FBI discovered a series of encrypted communications between high-ranking USAID officials, private contractors, and foreign banking institutions. The messages, though cryptic, pointed to a coordinated effort to divert funds intended for humanitarian aid into personal accounts. The amounts were staggering, billions of dollars, and many of the transactions were funneled through shadowy shell companies that existed solely for the purpose of laundering money. The evidence pointed to an international money laundering operation that had been operating for years, using USAID as a cover. It became clear that these transactions weren't isolated incidents. Instead, they were part of a broader, systematic effort to siphon off funds meant to help the world's poorest nations. Mitchell and her team quickly realized that the scale of the operation was so vast that it could take months, if not years, to untangle. And as they went deeper, they began to uncover something even more unsettling: the involvement of multiple foreign governments. Some of these governments were allies of the United States, while others were notorious for their ties to criminal enterprises. The question now was how deep the conspiracy went. Was USAID merely a pawn in a much larger game? And who else in the US government had been complicit in covering up the operation? The return of Musk as the investigation took its twists and turns. Musk's name began to resurface in the most unexpected ways. His companies once again were at the center of the controversy, this time with ties to the shadowy figures behind the money laundering operation. While Musk himself was not directly implicated, the deeper the FBI dug, the more his companies seemed intertwined with the network of criminals and corrupt officials who had been benefiting from the stolen funds. Musk's public image as a visionary entrepreneur was beginning to crack. The question now was whether he had been completely unaware of the underhanded dealings involving his companies, or whether he had played a part in the corruption. In a tense meeting with the FBI, Musk was questioned again, this time about his business dealings with USAID. The investigation had turned up evidence suggesting that some of Musk's contracts with USAID had been manipulated in ways that seemed to benefit high-ranking officials, including Whitman, who had already been arrested. Musk, for the first time in the investigation, seemed truly taken aback. "I had no idea," Musk insisted, his voice tight. "If there's any evidence that my companies were involved in this, I'll make it right. But I've never been involved in any corruption." Despite his protests, the FBI knew they couldn't rule Musk out just yet. If anything, his wealth and influence made him a powerful player in the game, whether he knew it or not. The next few days would be crucial in determining whether Musk was truly a victim of circumstance or an unwitting accomplice. The international reach the investigation had begun to reveal that the theft of USAID funds was not a domestic issue, but a global conspiracy. Several foreign governments, some of which had been recipients of US foreign aid, were now suspected of having played a role in the operation. The stolen funds had been funneled through a network of international accounts, many of which were linked to corrupt officials and organized crime syndicates in countries with little regard for transparency. One of the most chilling discoveries came when investigators traced the funds to a number of high-ranking officials in Russia who were believed to be part of a larger criminal network operating within the country. The evidence pointed to a possible Russian money laundering ring, which used USAID as a front to finance operations across the globe. While the US government had no solid proof linking these individuals directly to the heist, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Mitchell and her team faced a tough decision: how to proceed with international cooperation, especially with the potential diplomatic fallout. These revelations were explosive and could have serious consequences for US-Russia relations. Still, the FBI knew that they couldn't ignore these new leads, even if it meant risking the ire of foreign governments. The political fallout back. In Washington, President Elizabeth Carter faced increasing pressure. The scandal had quickly become a political liability, and the public outcry was reaching a boiling point. The American people were demanding answers, and political opponents were quick to point fingers, accusing the administration of failing to protect taxpayer dollars. President Carter called an emergency meeting with her top advisors to discuss the situation. "We can't let this drag on," she said, her voice firm. "We need to show the American people that we're doing everything we can to find the truth and hold those responsible accountable. The longer this drags out, the more trust we lose." The fallout from the scandal was becoming a political firestorm, and there were whispers in the corridors of power that some of Carter's own allies might be involved in the corruption. The more the FBI uncovered, the more it seemed that this scandal was not just about money, it was about the very integrity of the U.S. government. The American public was starting to feel like they had been lied to by those in power. And with the investigation showing no signs of slowing down, it was clear that the real conspiracy was only beginning to emerge. The news was everywhere now. The $100 billion scandal had gripped the world's attention, and despite the arrests and revelations, there was still no clear picture of who was behind the complex web of corruption. The FBI was pursuing every lead, but the deeper they dug, the more convoluted and far-reaching the conspiracy seemed. Agent Sarah Mitchell sat in a small, dimly lit office late one evening, surrounded by piles of evidence and a whiteboard filled with names, connections, and dates. The investigation was moving forward, but it felt as though they were chasing shadows. Every time they uncovered one piece of the puzzle, a dozen more pieces appeared, making it even harder to piece together the full story. A lead in the dark in the middle of the night, Mitchell received an unexpected call, a tip-off from a source, deep within the Department of Justice. The informant claimed to have information about an underground meeting between USAID officials, private contractors, and certain high-profile figures from abroad. These meetings had been held in secret locations across Europe and Asia, away from the prying eyes of regulators and government watchdogs. The informant suggested that the true mastermind behind the theft wasn't in Washington or Silicon Valley, but someone who operated in the shadows. Mitchell quickly relayed the information to her team. They began to track the leads to multiple countries, hoping to uncover more about the meetings and possibly the central figure behind it all. But every time they thought they were close to identifying the ringleader, the trail would grow cold. The network of corruption was elusive, and those involved were well protected by layers of secrecy, bribery, and influence. The key players, despite their setbacks, the FBI began to narrow down a list of individuals who were likely involved in orchestrating the theft. Among them was Vladimir Petrov, a powerful businessman with deep connections to Russian oligarchs and government officials. Petrov had been linked to multiple shady dealings in the past, but his ties to USAID projects were more recent and much more extensive. Petrov had been the silent partner behind several large-scale projects funded by USAID, many of which had received little to no scrutiny. The contracts, often awarded without competitive bidding, had funneled millions into companies controlled by Petrov and his associates. It was now clear that these projects were nothing more than a front to disguise the flow of stolen funds. Mitchell's investigation team focused heavily on Petrov's connections, tracing financial transactions from the shadowy companies to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and even back to Moscow. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that Petrov was not just a middleman in the scheme. He was the mastermind, and he had orchestrated the entire operation. The Musk dilemma, as the investigation zeroed in on Petrov, the question about Elon Musk's involvement remained unresolved. Was Musk simply a pawn caught in the crossfire, or did he know more than he was letting on? Musk had been cooperative during his interviews with the FBI, but his denial that his companies had any part in the illegal activities felt less convincing as more evidence came to light. His companies had been the recipients of several contracts. That seemed suspiciously timed and suspiciously lucrative. While Musk had no direct financial ties to Petrov, some of his closest business partners had links to individuals who were deeply embedded in the corruption network. A breakthrough came when one of Musk's former employees, David Harris, came forward with new information. Harris had worked as a senior executive at SpaceX and had been involved in some of the company's dealings with USAID. According to Harris, there were times when projects were fast-tracked, with little regard for due diligence. "I don't know if Musk was aware of the full extent of what was going on," Harris explained, "but I saw the red flags. Some of the projects were rushed through, with massive payments sent out to third-party contractors. It never sat right with me." Harris's statement was significant, though not conclusive. It didn't directly implicate Musk, but it painted a picture of a business environment where things were done quickly and sometimes carelessly. There were enough unanswered questions about Musk's company's involvement that the FBI couldn't rule out the possibility of him being an unwitting accomplice. The global webays, the investigation into Petrov and his network continued. The global nature of the conspiracy became even clearer. The stolen USAID funds were being used to finance operations in some of the world's most corrupt and dangerous regions. In Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, the money had been funneled to groups that had no interest in humanitarian aid. They were more interested in power, weapons, and influence. The CIA became involved as the US government realized that the corruption was not only domestic, it was impacting national security. The funds were being used to fuel conflict in regions where the US had strategic interests, and it was clear that the stolen money had been funneled into the hands of dangerous players with ties to organized crime and terrorism. The world was beginning to wake up to the implications of the scandal. For the first time in years, the American people were starting to question whether the government could be trusted with the very funds that were meant to help the most vulnerable populations on the planet. Was the corruption at the highest levels of USAID just the tip of the iceberg? And how many more officials, businessmen, and foreign leaders were involved in this global scheme? Musk under scrutiny. Again. Meanwhile, as the world watched, Elon Musk was once again thrust into the spotlight. This time, the scrutiny wasn't just about his company's involvement in the scandal, it was about his connections to Petrov. New reports surfaced, revealing that Musk had met with Petrov at a secretive business summit in Monaco several years. The meeting had been brief, but the fact that the two men had crossed paths added a new layer to the investigation. Were they just two business people discussing potential opportunities, or was there more to the story? Musk's lawyers quickly responded, denying any wrongdoing and calling the claims baseless. However, the media and public opinion were shifting. People were beginning to wonder if Musk, despite his image as a tech visionary, had been playing a much darker game. The countdown to the truth, with the investigation now reaching its peak, Agent Mitchell knew that the FBI had one final shot to bring down the network. Petrov had been elusive, and as his power and influence began to surface, it became clear that the case was no longer just about the $100 billion theft. It was about something much bigger: the integrity of global systems, the trust of the American people, and the very foundation of international diplomacy. The FBI had made incredible progress, but the true test was yet to come. As Mitchell and her team closed in on Petrov and the rest of the conspirators, they realized that the final revelation could be far more shocking than anything they had uncovered so far. The investigation was on the brink of a breakthrough. As the FBI closed in on Vladimir Petrov, the mastermind behind the global conspiracy, new details began to surface that would change everything. Every lead, every piece of evidence pointed to the conclusion that no one could have anticipated, not even Agent Sarah Mitchell. Petrov had remained elusive, operating from the shadows, using a network of intermediaries and offshore accounts to move billions of dollars from the coffers of USAID into the hands of corrupt officials and criminal organizations worldwide. But now the net was tightening. Mitchell's team had uncovered encrypted communications and documents that would expose the final shocking truth about who was really behind this global operation. The web titan's late one evening, Mitchell received an encrypted message from her contact at the CIA. It was a breakthrough, a series of intercepted emails between Petrov and high-ranking US officials. The emails were chilling. They showed that Petrov had been working with a clandestine group of American operatives who had been secretly coordinating the movement of funds across the globe. One of the emails stood out in particular. It was sent from David Harris, the former SpaceX executive who had already provided critical information. The subject line read, "Operation Uplink, Final Phase." The contents of the email revealed that Petrov's network had been leveraging USAID to fund military operations in several conflict zones around the world. These weren't humanitarian efforts, as had been claimed. The money was being funneled into the hands of rebel factions, mercenary groups, and even paramilitary organizations with the goal of destabilizing governments in key regions. The implications were staggering. What had started as a simple case of stolen funds had now expanded into a full-fledged international conspiracy with national security ramifications. The United States wasn't just being swindled, it was being manipulated from within, its foreign aid used as a cover to fund illegal operations. Mitchell's heart sank as she read through the final lines of the email. Elon Musk's name appeared at the bottom. It was clear that Musk had been unknowingly entangled in this operation, but how deeply? The email suggested that Musk had been lured into this web, with his companies acting as fronts for Petrov's operations. Yet nothing was clear enough to make any direct accusations. Yet the Musk puzzle. For the FBI, the most pressing question was whether Elon Musk was a victim or a co-conspirator. Musk had adamantly denied any knowledge of the corruption, but as Mitchell examined the evidence, the lines blurred. Musk's companies had been crucial in providing technological infrastructure that Petrov's network had used to conceal the flow of stolen money. SpaceX, with its vast satellite network, had provided encrypted communication channels used by Petrov's operatives. Tesla had been involved in the transportation of materials for humanitarian projects in war-torn areas, but these deliveries had been rerouted to support military operations instead. Could Musk have been completely unaware of this? The evidence was damning, but the reality was far more complex. Musk's defense team argued that his companies had only ever provided goods and services under the assumption that they were working with USAID to promote peace and stability. The contracts, they claimed, were legitimate, and the rest of the operation was outside his purview. However, with the evidence stacking against him, the question remained: how could Musk have missed the signs? Was it possible that his desire to build his global empire blinded him to the shady dealings happening under his nose? Or had he truly been a victim of deceit, just another pawn in a game played by far more dangerous players? The unexpected betrayal. The investigation took another shocking turn when George Whitman, the USAID official arrested earlier, made a stunning confession during a secretive interrogation. Whitman, who had initially denied any involvement in the conspiracy, broke under pressure and revealed a hidden truth. He had been blackmailed by a mysterious figure who had ties to a much larger criminal syndicate. "I thought I was just doing what was expected of me," Whitman confessed, his voice trembling. "They threatened my family, my career. I didn't have a choice. Petrov, he has people everywhere, people with power in the highest places. Musk, he was part of the plan but not the mastermind. Petrov was the one pulling the strings all along." Whitman's testimony shook the FBI to its core. Not only did it confirm that Petrov was the central figure in the conspiracy, but it also implicated high-level government officials who had been working with him. Whitman's claim that Musk had been part of the plan confirmed the FBI's suspicions that Musk's companies had been leveraged in ways Musk never intended. But what Whitman said next was the most surprising. Musk had been targeted from the start. Petrov's network had manipulated the contracts and ensured that Musk's companies were drawn into the operation without his knowledge. Musk had been used as a pawn in a much larger game of power, one that involved both global corruption and manipulation at the highest levels. The final confrontation, as the investigation reached its climax, Mitchell knew that she had only one chance: to confront Petrov and uncover the full scope of the conspiracy. With the FBI closing in on Petrov's location in Switzerland, she coordinated a final operation to capture him before he could escape. Time was running out. Petrov had already gone into hiding, and if he wasn't apprehended soon, he would vanish into the dark underworld of international crime. The FBI raided a secluded estate in the Swiss Alps where Petrov had been hiding, but by the time they arrived, he was already gone. Petrov had left behind a trail of documents that led Mitchell and her team to the final piece of the puzzle: the identities of the key players who had helped orchestrate the theft. The names on that list were enough to send shockwaves through the highest corridors of power. names that would ultimately bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. The truth uncovered in the aftermath of the raid, the FBI released a statement confirming that they had dismantled the international conspiracy involving Petrov, high-ranking U.S. officials, and several multinational corporations. The true scale of the theft, $100 billion, was only the beginning. The corruption that had been uncovered would take years to fully unravel, but for now the first step had been taken. As for Musk, he was cleared of any criminal wrongdoing in relation to the conspiracy. While his companies had been involved, there was no evidence to suggest that he had been anything more than an unwitting participant. Yet, the damage to his reputation was done. The public's perception of Musk had changed forever, and the trust he had built over the years had been shattered. The fallout from the scandal was far-reaching. Governments, corporations, and individuals across the world would have to answer for their roles in the conspiracy. But for Mitchell, the case was far from over. The truth had been uncovered, but there were still many unanswered questions. The scandal had already rocked the foundations of global diplomacy, but as the weeks went by, the ripples of the $100 billion corruption scheme began to spread farther and farther. The investigation had uncovered deep corruption within multiple levels of government, corporate misdeeds, and even connections to military destabilization efforts. What started as a simple case of misappropriated funds had now blossomed into a global geopolitical crisis. For Elon Musk, the road ahead was uncertain. While he had been cleared of criminal involvement, the media frenzy around his name continued. The public perception of Musk had shifted dramatically. His image as a trailblazing entrepreneur, admired for his work with SpaceX, Tesla, and other ventures, had been tainted by the lingering doubts about his connections to the conspiracy. The tech mogul's empire now faced mounting pressure from investors, government regulators, and the public. Musk's reckoning Musk had always prided himself on transparency and innovation, but now he found himself grappling with questions that extended far beyond his typical business dealings. Could he rebuild trust, or had the damage already been done? Every move he made was being scrutinized, from his tweets to his quarterly earnings reports. Investors were nervous. Governments were watching. Sarah Mitchell, on the other hand, found herself at the center of an investigation that seemed to never end. The FBI had just uncovered new leads that hinted at even deeper layers of the conspiracy. While Petrov was still in hiding, Mitchell's team had uncovered traces of untraceable financial transactions involving shadow companies operating across continents, moving money through offshore accounts and shell corporations. There were links to even more powerful people, politicians, businessmen, and military officials who had turned a blind eye to the theft because it served their interests. The corruption didn't just stop with the theft of USAID funds. It was about the influence that Petrov's network wielded over global systems. Governments had been compromised, and entire economies had been manipulated through the illegal movement of resources. But Mitchell had a personal mission too. In the back of her mind, she knew that uncovering the full scope of the operation might mean digging deeper into Musk's role, even if he had already been cleared of wrongdoing. After all, Musk had been so closely tied to the operation, whether wittingly or not, that it was hard to completely exonerate him in the court of public opinion. For Mitchell, it wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about making sure justice was served regardless of the consequences. Musk's media storm as Musk began facing mounting pressure. He addressed the public in an exclusive interview with Anderson Cooper on CNN. It was his first time publicly commenting on the scandal since the FBI cleared him of any direct involvement. "I'm here to tell you all, frankly," Musk said, his voice steady yet weighed with the tension of the moment, "that I had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. My companies, SpaceX, Tesla, we were just doing what we always do, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But somewhere along the way we were dragged into something far bigger than any of us could have imagined." He continued, "I was deceived. My team was deceived. And I deeply regret that the work we did for USAID, which we thought was helping people, ended up being misused for political and military purposes. It's something I will never forgive myself for." The interview was a gamble, a public plea to restore faith in his image. And yet for many it wasn't enough. Social media exploded with mixed reactions. Some felt sympathy for Musk, others saw it as an attempt to save his brand. The questions surrounding his involvement were not easily answered, and many people wondered, if Musk didn't know, how could he not have seen the signs? The rising tide of resistance. Across the globe, protests began erupting in response to the revelations of the corruption scandal. In Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, people were angry. USAID was supposed to help the poorest, the most vulnerable, and yet billions of dollars had been siphoned off to fuel conflicts and instability. Families in war-torn countries now found themselves questioning the very aid that had been promised to help them. In Washington, D.C., the pressure was building. Congressional hearings began to investigate USAID's role in the scandal, and multiple lawmakers publicly demanded answers. Liberal and conservative factions alike called for greater accountability, each blaming the other side for letting the situation spiral out of control. For Mitchell, the political circus surrounding the investigation was frustrating. The need for justice was being clouded by political games, but she couldn't afford to be distracted. Petrov was still out there, and every day that passed without his capture made the whole situation more precarious. The last piece of the puzzle months. Into the investigation, Mitchell received an anonymous tip that would send the entire investigation into its final phase. Petrov's network wasn't just operating in the shadows. They had deep ties to the Chinese government, whose officials had been complicit in laundering stolen funds. A secret meeting had been arranged in Singapore, where Petrov was rumored to meet with officials from China's Ministry of State Security. The FBI had just intercepted a message detailing the time and place of the meeting. Mitchell knew this was her chance to catch Petrov before he slipped away forever. She quickly mobilized her team, coordinating with the CIA, Interpol, and local law enforcement. The task was simple: intercept the meeting and take Petrov into custody. However, as she prepared for the operation, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Petrov had proven to be elusive, and this was his last chance to escape. The night of the operation, Mitchell and her team moved in on the meeting. Location? The clock was ticking. The final confrontation, inside a high-rise hotel suite overlooking the harbor, Petrov was waiting. Unbeknownst to the FBI, one of Petrov's operatives had tipped him off. When the FBI stormed the suite, they found it empty, with nothing but a single piece of paper on the desk, a map of offshore accounts and several names, the ultimate network of corruption reaching far beyond Petrov himself. But Petrov had disappeared once again. As Mitchell stared at the map in disbelief, she realized that the scandal was far from over. It wasn't just about Petrov anymore. It was about the entire web of corruption, still hidden beneath the surface, with connections to governments, companies, and individuals all over the world. The FBI's failure to capture Vladimir Petrov that fateful night in Singapore only deepened the mystery surrounding the global conspiracy. Despite mounting pressure, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. Petrov was still at large, slipping through their grasp like smoke. The map he left behind had been analyzed in great detail, but it only led to more questions. The names, the offshore accounts, the networks of influence. It was a tangled web that appeared to have no end. Sarah Mitchell felt like she was chasing ghosts. Every lead seemed to dissipate. Every operation fell short. She knew they were close, but the closer they got, the more elusive Petrov became. As the investigation dragged on, cracks began to show in the global political and corporate systems they were trying to hold together. The deeper they dug, the more shocking connections they uncovered. Corporations, military contractors, even heads of state. Everyone seemed to have their hands in the pot. The hidden mastermind, a breakthrough, came one morning when Mitchell received a call from an unlikely source, David Harris. The former SpaceX executive had been providing critical information, but until now, his involvement had been peripheral at best. This time, his voice was different, urgent, desperate. "They're pulling the strings from somewhere deeper, Sarah," Harris said, his voice shaky. Petrov isn't the end of the line. There's someone else behind this, someone even bigger. Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Who's behind Petrov? I don't know for sure, Harris replied. But there's a group, an old network. They're connected to Russia, China, and several powerful figures in the US government. Petrov's just the visible part of something much larger, something more dangerous. The name Harris mentioned, the Black Web, sent a chill down Mitchell's spine. It wasn't the first time she had heard whispers about the group, but it was the first time someone had been brave enough to acknowledge its existence. The Black Web was a shadow organization rumored to operate in the highest echelons of power. Its members were untouchable, their influence immeasurable. Some believed it was a relic of Cold War-era operations, a network designed to control information and money on a global scale. Mitchell knew that Petrov was just a cog in the machine, but this new information changed everything. The conspiracy had always seemed like a complex puzzle, but now it appeared that the puzzle had been intentionally scattered across the world to make it impossible to solve. The Black Web was the missing link, the entity that had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. Rising tensions, as the FBI pieced together Harris's information, they discovered that Elon Musk had been caught in the middle of a much larger game. While it was clear that he had been unknowingly swept up in Petrov's schemes, it was also evident that Musk's companies had been used as a means of leverage by the Black Web to further their goals. The multi-billion-dollar contracts, the satellite systems, the transportation networks, they weren't just tools of progress. They were part of a massive web of influence that spanned across continents and industries. Mitchell found herself questioning Musk's true role in all of this. Was he merely a pawn in a much grander scheme, or had he been complicit in turning a blind eye to the forces manipulating his empire? The investigation had already cleared him of any direct involvement, but there were still gaps in the timeline, areas where Musk's companies had facilitated operations that, in hindsight, appeared far too convenient. Yet the more Mitchell looked into it, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Musk was a visionary, yes, but his thirst for progress and innovation had made him vulnerable to the very system he had helped create. In the end, was he a hero blinded by ambition, or was he simply another cog in the Black Web's machine, the global stage? With the unveiling of the Black Web's existence, the global political landscape began to shift. Several world leaders who had been involved in the conspiracy found themselves under intense scrutiny. Senator Angela Carter, a vocal advocate for international aid and reform, was suddenly linked to off-the-books dealings with Petrov's network. General Leonhardt, a retired military official with ties to covert operations, was implicated in using USAID funds to fuel paramilitary factions in Eastern Europe. Their connections to the Black Web were becoming too obvious to ignore. In Washington, D.C., the Senate held a series of hearings to address the growing scandal. Carter's resignation was demanded by several members of Congress, and General Leonhardt faced a full military investigation. The investigation also reached the United Nations, where diplomats were scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The Black Web's network was vast, and no one knew exactly where it would end. Mitchell and her team worked tirelessly, conducting interviews and piecing together testimony from whistleblowers, some of whom had been living in fear for years. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Petrov and the corruption he represented were just the tip of the iceberg. The real power lay in the hands of a shadowy group that spanned across governments, corporations, and clandestine organizations. The Black Web, the global fallout. As the investigation neared its climax, the public's anger grew louder. Citizens around the world, once hopeful that foreign aid would make a difference, were now questioning everything. Thousands of people who had relied on USAID's resources began to protest. The trust that had once been placed in international institutions began to crumble. Meanwhile, Musk's future remained uncertain. His public image had been severely damaged, even though he had been exonerated of any criminal wrongdoing. The media storm surrounding him was relentless, with some people calling for him to step down from his leadership roles in his companies. Others, however, continued to support him, insisting that he had been a victim of a global conspiracy far beyond his control. Yet the most shocking aspect of all was the realization that, while Musk had been unaware of the full extent of Petrov's operations, he had been complicit in one of the largest financial schemes in modern history. His companies had been used to facilitate the movement of stolen funds and the advancement of secretive military agendas. Whether he had known it or not, Musk had unknowingly provided the tools for the black web to execute its plan on a global scale. A final decision. Mitchell knew that the final chapter of this investigation was approaching. With every new revelation, the stakes grew higher. Petrov remained elusive, but the black web was a far greater threat, and it was becoming clear that the only way to dismantle it was to confront the powerful figures behind it. As the FBI prepared for their final raid, Mitchell made a silent promise to herself. This time they would not fail. The day had come, the final chapter of a scandal that had gripped the world for months, shaken economies, and destroyed lives. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, and the shadowy organization known as the Black Web was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was out in the open, and its true extent was staggering. In Washington, D.C., the air was thick with anticipation. Sarah Mitchell and her team were preparing for the operation that would change everything. After months of gathering intel, analyzing financial records, and following a trail of deception, they were now ready to take down the masterminds behind the scheme, Petrov and the invisible powers that had been pulling the strings. But even as Mitchell sat in the command center, her mind was racing. The Black Web wasn't just a criminal syndicate, it was an idea, a network so deeply embedded in the fabric of global power that dismantling it would require more than just arrests and court orders. It would require a reckoning, a moment when the entire world would be forced to confront the truth of the systems they had trusted. The final confrontation, Petrov had been elusive, slipping away just as Mitchell thought she had him cornered. But now, the pieces were finally falling into place. The CIA had located Petrov in a safe house in Moscow, and it was time to act. "We go in at midnight," Mitchell said, her voice steady as she addressed her team. "This ends tonight." The mission was set. The FBI, CIA, and Interpol had all coordinated their efforts to bring down Petrov and his remaining allies. The world was watching, and they couldn't afford to fail. Meanwhile, Elon Musk sat in his office staring out at the sprawling view of Tesla's headquarters. His empire, once a beacon of innovation, was now entangled in a scandal of epic proportions. Musk had been cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, but the shadow of the Black Web still loomed over him. His involvement, however indirect, had irrevocably tarnished his reputation. The media was relentless, the public unforgiving. Despite his past achievements, Musk was no longer the untouchable visionary he once was. The arrest of Petrov. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and the operation began. FBI agents, military personnel, and intelligence officers moved swiftly through the streets of Moscow. Petrov had one last ally, Ilya Volkov, a high-ranking official within the Russian government who had protected him for years. But as the EE team closed in on the compound, Volkov's betrayal became clear. Petrov wasn't at the safe house. He had escaped once again. "Damn it," Mitchell cursed under her breath as she stood in the middle of the operation room. The final piece had slipped through her fingers. They had caught Volkov, but Petrov remained a ghost. Then a call came through. The team had found something in Petrov's safe house, documents detailing the full extent of the Black Web's operations, including the identities of the key figures involved. The Black Web was even more pervasive than anyone had realized. Names of politicians, businessmen, military officers, all deeply connected to the conspiracy. The map Mitchell had seen months ago was only a fraction of the entire network. The collapse of the Black Web. Mitchell's heart pounded as the operation transitioned to the next phase. While Petrov was still at large, his network was beginning to crumble. Governments around the world, Russia, China, and even the United States, now had no choice but to confront the corruption that had been lurking in their systems for decades. In the US, Senator Angela Carter had already resigned, and more politicians were falling like dominoes. The military-industrial complex was under intense scrutiny, and high-ranking generals were being investigated for their ties to illegal military actions funded by the stolen USAID money. As Mitchell analyzed the documents, she realized that Petrov had been operating under the radar for years, leveraging international influence and using companies like SpaceX, Tesla, and others as pawns in a global chess game. But even as the world's most powerful institutions began to break apart, there was still one question left. Who was behind it all? Musk's decision, back in the US, Elon Musk was in the middle of an existential crisis. His company's involvement in the scandal was undeniable, and the public backlash was only intensifying. But he wasn't just a victim. Musk had to decide whether he was going to allow this scandal to define him or if he would take control of his future. He called a press conference, a rare move for someone who typically stayed out of the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Musk began, looking directly into the camera, "the events that have transpired over the past few months have been nothing short of surreal. I've learned a lot during this process, about myself, about trust, and about the systems we've all been a part of. What I want to say to the public is this. I take full responsibility for my involvement, whether direct or indirect, in this global conspiracy. But what matters now is how we move forward." Musk's voice softened. "We are committed to transparency. My companies will undergo a full audit. We will work with the authorities to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. The truth has been exposed, and I will not shy away from it. I can't change the past, but I will do everything in my power to rebuild trust with the people who believed in me." It was a bold move. The world was watching, and Musk's words would be scrutinized. But for the first time in months, it felt like he had taken control of his own narrative. The resolution as the investigation continued to unravel, the full scope of the Black Web's network began to emerge. The conspiracy wasn't just a financial scandal, it was a corruption of global power. Petrov might have been the face, but the hands behind the curtain were still working to maintain their influence. In the months that followed, Mitchell worked tirelessly to track down the last of the conspirators, but the damage was done. The political landscape had been irrevocably changed. Governments had been shaken, corporations had fallen, and Elon Musk, once the symbol of technological progress, was now the face of a new era of accountability. Despite the wreckage, there was a sense of hope. The scandal had exposed deep flaws in the systems that governed the world, but it also sparked a movement toward greater transparency, ethics, and global cooperation. People demanded more from their leaders and their corporations. The world had seen how easily power could be manipulated, but it had also seen the power of truth and accountability. As for Petrov, he was never captured. His fate remained a mystery, but his legacy was one of warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the lengths some would go to protect it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The Black Web may have been exposed, but its influence still lingers. What do you think is the next step for the world after this scandal? Will we see real change, or will history repeat itself?